Everyone laughed when the Chinese millionaire ridiculed the black waiter, until he replied in Chinese. "This stupid waiter doesn't even know what I'm saying about him." Li Zhang's voice cuts through the elegant crystal ballroom like a knife, his words in Mandarin dripping with contempt as he gestures toward the young black waiter standing frozen beside his table. The room full of wealthy elites erupts in nervous laughter, not understanding the language but recognizing the cruelty in his tone. David Carter stands there, his hands trembling slightly as he grips his serving tray, feeling the weight of every eye in the Grand Meridian Hotel's most exclusive dining room. The man who just humiliated him is Li Zhang, a Chinese billionaire whose net worth could buy small countries. His Armani suit costs more than David makes in 6 months. His Patek Philippe watch could pay for David's mother's cancer treatments for an entire year. But what Li Zhang doesn't know, what none of these powerful people know, is that David understands every single word being said about him. Every insult, every cruel joke, every racist slur delivered in the language Li assumes no one else speaks. You see, David Carter isn't just a waiter struggling to pay bills. He's a PhD candidate in linguistic anthropology at Columbia University who speaks 4 languages fluently. He's working double shifts in this ballroom not because he lacks intelligence or ambition, but because his mother is dying of cancer and someone has to pay for the treatments insurance won't cover. Li Zhang continues his verbal assault in Mandarin, calling David a worthless servant, and worse, his confidence growing with each insult as the wealthy crowd watches in uncomfortable silence. He's performed this routine before, using his linguistic privilege to humiliate service workers who he assumes can't defend themselves. But tonight, Li Zhang has chosen the wrong target. Because in the next 28 minutes, this arrogant billionaire is about to learn that assumptions can be dangerous, that intelligence doesn't wear a uniform, and that sometimes the most devastating response to cruelty isn't anger. It's perfect, fluent Mandarin delivered with the grace of someone who truly understands what dignity means. What happens when David finally opens his mouth will not only silence a room full of millionaires, but will prove that true power has nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with character. This is the story of how a racist billionaire's worst nightmare came true, the moment his victim turned out to be smarter than he was, and strong enough to fight back with nothing but words, wisdom, and the kind of quiet courage that money can never buy. Get ready to witness the most epic takedown you've ever seen, not with fists or fury, but with intelligence so sharp it will cut through prejudice like a blade through silk. This is another story from Touching Boss Stories channel. Please like, share, and subscribe. It encourages us to serve you with the best of stories. The evening began like any other exclusive gathering at the Grand Meridian, a carefully orchestrated display of wealth and influence where the guest list read like a who's who of international business. Li Zhang had spared no expense for this dinner, not because he was generous, but because every detail was calculated to demonstrate his superiority. The menu featured delicacies flown in from around the world: Kobe beef from Japan, caviar from Russia, truffles from France. Each course was a statement, a reminder that Li could afford what others could only dream of. Li sat at the head table, naturally, surrounded by his usual circle of admirers and ass-kissers. There was Margaret Rothschild, the pharmaceutical heiress who laughed too loudly at his jokes, Vladimir Petrov, the oil magnate who nodded sagely at Li's every pronouncement, and James Wellington III, the investment banker who took notes on Li's casual observations as if they were gospel from on high. "You know," Li said, swirling his $1,000 wine, "in China, we have a saying, the fish rots from the head down. It means that incompetence starts at the top and spreads throughout an organization. But here in America, I think the saying should be reversed. The rot starts at the bottom and infects everything above it." The table erupted in nervous laughter. This was Li's specialty, making observations that were both profound and cruel, philosophical and personal. His guests never knew if they were being enlightened or insulted, so they chose the safe route of agreement. "Speaking of which," Margaret chimed in, desperate to stay in Li's good graces, "have you noticed how the service has declined everywhere? These people simply don't have the work ethic that built this country." Li nodded sagely. "It's a cultural problem. Some people are born to serve, others to lead. The tragedy is when those meant to serve forget their place." As if summoned by the conversation, David appeared at their table to refill water glasses. He moved with practiced efficiency, his presence so unobtrusive that the conversation continued as if he were invisible. This was his skill, developed over months of serving the ultra-wealthy, the ability to anticipate needs without drawing attention to himself. The prawns were exceptional tonight, Lee announced, not to David but to the table, as if the waiter were merely an extension of the kitchen equipment. I suppose even the help can't ruin seafood that starts out perfect. David's hand didn't tremble as he filled Lee's glass, though something flickered behind his eyes. He'd heard variations of this conversation at every table he'd served tonight. The wealthy loved nothing more than discussing the failings of those who served them, secure in the knowledge that their targets couldn't respond. "Will there be anything else, sir?" David asked, his voice professionally neutral. Lee didn't even glance in his direction. "Make sure the wine doesn't run out. Some of us are discussing important matters." David nodded and began to step back, but the space was tight between tables. As he turned to navigate around a guest who had pushed his chair back, David's elbow brushed against Lee's shoulder, the lightest of contacts, no more than a butterfly landing on silk. But Li Zhang reacted as if he'd been struck by lightning. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Lee's voice cut across the ballroom like a whip crack. Conversations at nearby tables stopped mid-sentence. All eyes turned toward the commotion. David immediately bowed slightly, his training kicking in. "I apologize, sir. The space is—" "Don't make excuses," Lee snapped. "Do you have any idea who I am? Do you understand what your carelessness could have cost?" The question hung in the air like a sword. David stood perfectly still, his dignity intact even as every eye in the room bored into him. This was the moment Lee had been building toward all evening, the chance to demonstrate his power over someone who couldn't fight back. "I sincerely apologize, Mr. Zhang," David said, his voice calm and measured. "It was entirely my fault." But Lee wasn't done. The apology wasn't enough. He needed to make an example, to remind everyone present of the natural order of things. His eyes gleamed with the particular cruelty of those who've never known consequences for their actions. Lee turned to his table companions and began speaking in rapid Mandarin, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent ballroom. "This stupid servant doesn't even know I'm talking about him," Lee said with a cruel laugh. "Look at him standing there like a cow waiting for slaughter." Lee was confident in his linguistic armor. In his experience, Americans were notoriously monolingual, especially those working service jobs. He could say anything he wanted, secure in the knowledge that his target would stand there helplessly while being verbally eviscerated in a language he couldn't comprehend. Margaret and Vladimir exchanged glances, recognizing cruelty even without understanding the words. James Wellington looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Li Zhang was worth too much to their firm to risk offending. Li continued his verbal assault, each word carefully chosen to maximize humiliation. "This worthless servant thinks if he stands there quietly, we'll forget he exists," Li sneered in Mandarin. "But some stains are permanent. He should be grateful I'm teaching him about respect." The other Chinese speakers in the room, a few guests and some staff, shifted uncomfortably, but none dared intervene. David stood through it all, his posture straight, his expression neutral. To the watching crowd, he appeared to be enduring a storm he couldn't understand, maintaining his professionalism despite the obvious hostility being directed at him. But something in David's eyes had changed. A spark had ignited, barely visible but burning bright for those who knew how to look. Li Zhang, drunk on his own power and the sound of his own voice, was too intoxicated by dominance to notice that his victim was no longer quite so helpless. The ballroom held its collective breath, waiting to see how this drama would unfold. Most expected David to simply endure the humiliation and retreat, as staff were trained to do. Others hoped someone would intervene, though none felt brave enough to challenge Li Zhang directly. None of them expected what happened next. If you're as shocked by Li Zhang's behavior as I am, hit that subscribe button right now. This story is just getting started, and you won't believe what happens when David finally responds. If you were David in this situation, would you have stayed silent to keep your job and protect your family's income, or would you have found a way to speak up? Let me know in the comments. Your answer might reveal more about your character than you think. Li Zhang was just getting warmed up. The initial rush of putting someone in their place had awakened something predatory in him, and the audience of wealthy onlookers only fed his appetite for dominance. He leaned back in his chair, a king on his throne, and continued his verbal assault with the confidence of a man who had never faced consequences for his cruelty. "This stupid waiter doesn't even know what I'm saying," Li said with a laugh, the Mandarin flowing smoothly from his lips. "He's so stupid he doesn't even realize I'm talking about him." His dinner companions chuckled nervously, not understanding the words but recognizing the mockery in Li's tone. They were complicit in their silence, willing to watch a man be humiliated rather than risk their own social standing. Li continued, his voice growing louder, more theatrical. He was performing now, using David as a prop in a show designed to demonstrate his own superiority. "Look at him," Li said in Mandarin, gesturing toward David as if he were an object on display. "Standing there like a cow waiting for slaughter. This is what happens when people don't know their place in the world." The cruelty in Li's voice was unmistakable, transcending language barriers. Even those who couldn't understand Mandarin could hear the contempt, the dehumanization, the casual dismissal of another human being's dignity. Some guests looked away, unable to watch. Others stared in fascination at this display of raw power. David remained motionless, his hands at his sides, his breathing steady. To the casual observer, he might have seemed resigned to his fate, another service worker absorbing abuse because he needed the job. But something was building behind his calm exterior, like pressure in a steam valve slowly reaching the breaking point. Li, emboldened by what he perceived as submission, decided to involve his audience more directly. He switched to English, speaking loudly enough for the entire ballroom to hear. "You see," Li announced, "this is the problem with American service today. No pride in their work, no attention to detail, no respect for their betters. In China, someone who showed such carelessness would be dismissed immediately." He gestured toward David with his wineglass, the gesture itself an insult. "But here, we're supposed to pretend that everyone is equal, that a waiter is somehow the same as a CEO. It's this kind of thinking that's destroying Western civilization." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some guests nodded in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably. A few looked genuinely disturbed by Li's words, but none spoke up. The social mathematics were clear. Li Zhang's wealth bought him the right to say whatever he wanted, and everyone else's silence was the price of maintaining their access to his circle. "Of course," Li continued, warming to his theme, "we can't expect much from people who lack proper education, proper breeding, proper values. Some people are simply born to serve, while others are destined to lead. It's not their fault they can't rise above their station, it's simply nature." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Li had moved beyond personal insult into the realm of racial stereotype, class warfare, and social Darwinism. He was no longer just humiliating David, he was attacking everything David represented, everyone who looked like him, everyone who worked in service industries to support their families. And still, David stood silently. But now, something was different. The other staff members had begun to take notice. Waiters and busboys who had been going about their duties now stood at the edges of the room, watching the drama unfold. They recognized one of their own being attacked, and while they couldn't intervene directly without risking their own jobs, their presence created a sense of solidarity, a quiet support that David could feel even in his isolation. Li, drunk on attention and wine, decided to return to Mandarin for his final flourish. He wanted to deliver an insult so crushing, so personally devastating, that it would leave no doubt about who held power in this room. "Look at this black servant," Li said in Mandarin, using a particularly vile racial slur. "He thinks if he stands there quietly enough, we'll forget he exists. But some stains are permanent." The Chinese phrase was particularly cruel, a racial slur that would have started fights in other contexts, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who believed himself untouchable. Li smiled as he delivered it, certain that his words were falling on uncomprehending ears. But for the first time since the confrontation began, David's expression changed. It was subtle, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a barely perceptible shift in posture. To most observers, he still appeared passive, defeated even. But to those who looked closely, something fundamental had shifted. Li, oblivious to the change, pressed on. "He should be grateful I'm teaching him about respect," he said in Mandarin, his voice growing more animated. The ballroom had fallen into an uncomfortable silence. Even Li's dinner companions had stopped their nervous laughter, sensing that something was about to happen though they couldn't say what. The tension was palpable, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air itself seems to vibrate with potential energy. David took a small step forward, and the movement was so unexpected, so contrary to what everyone expected from a humiliated service worker, that conversations at nearby tables stopped entirely. The ballroom that had been filled with the gentle clatter of silverware and the murmur of wealthy voices suddenly became as quiet as a cathedral. Li, finally noticing that David had moved, looked up with surprise and irritation. "What are you still doing here?" he demanded in English. "I thought I made it clear that your services are no longer required at this table." David met Li's gaze directly, and for the first time all evening, Li saw something that made him slightly uncomfortable. There was intelligence in those eyes, and something else. A depth of understanding that seemed impossible given what Li assumed about the man standing before him. "I was just wondering," David said, his voice calm and measured, "if you were finished with your performance." The word, performance, hung in the air like a challenge. Li's face flushed with anger and confusion. How dare this waiter speak to him as an equal? How dare he use language that suggested criticism rather than deference? But before Li could respond, before he could unleash another torrent of abuse, David did something that would change the trajectory of the evening, something that would turn a simple case of workplace harassment into a masterclass in dignity and intelligence. David began to speak. And the first words out of his mouth were in perfect, fluent Mandarin. "If your heart is racing like mine is right now, you need to subscribe immediately. This moment is about to become legendary, and you don't want to miss what David says next. Would you walk away to keep your job and avoid confrontation, or would you find a way to stand up for yourself even if it meant risking everything? Your answer says a lot about how you handle injustice in your own life." The silence in the Grand Meridian's crystal ballroom was so complete that the sound of David setting his service tray on a nearby table echoed like a gunshot. Every eye in the room was focused on this young black waiter who had just been publicly humiliated, watching to see if he would finally retreat in defeat or somehow find the courage to respond. Li Zhang sat back in his chair, a smug smile playing across his lips, confident that he had definitively established the natural order of things. His dinner companions watched nervously, unsure whether to laugh or look away. The other guests throughout the ballroom had stopped their conversations entirely, sensing that they were witnessing something significant though they couldn't yet say what. David straightened his shoulders, looked Li Zhang directly in the eyes, and spoke with a clarity that cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "A man's true worth isn't measured by his money, but by how he treats those who serve him." The words were delivered in perfect Mandarin, with the crisp pronunciation of someone who had studied not just the language but the culture behind it. The meaning hit the room like a thunderbolt. Li Zhang's wine glass froze halfway to his lips. His eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in disbelief. Around the table, his dinner companions exchanged bewildered glances. Margaret Rothschild's mouth actually fell open. Vladimir Petrov leaned forward as if he hadn't heard correctly. James Wellington looked like he'd just witnessed a magic trick he couldn't explain. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds. In that brief span, the power dynamic in the room underwent a seismic shift. The man who had been dismissed as ignorant help had just demonstrated not only that he understood every insult that had been hurled at him, but that he possessed the education and eloquence to respond with devastating precision. You speak Chinese?" Li stammered in Mandarin, his voice barely above a whisper. David's response was calm, measured, and delivered with the confidence of someone who had spent years perfecting his linguistic skills. "I not only speak Chinese, I also understand the cultural nuances, including what true politeness and respect actually mean." The translation rippled through the crowd as the few other Mandarin speakers present whispered to their companions. Li Zhang's face cycled through a range of emotions: shock, embarrassment, anger, and something that might have been fear. He had built his entire performance on the assumption that David was helpless, ignorant, unable to defend himself. That foundation had just crumbled completely. But David wasn't finished. He had endured months of condescension from wealthy patrons, years of assumptions about his intelligence based on his job and the color of his skin. Tonight, those assumptions had crossed a line into outright cruelty, and he had reached his breaking point. "Sir," David continued in Mandarin, his voice growing stronger, "the words you just spoke weren't merely insults. They revealed the character of a man who thinks money can buy respect, but has actually only purchased fear and false compliance." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Several guests began whispering excitedly to their companions, trying to process what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a multilingual surprise, it was a philosophical dismantling of everything Li Zhang represented. Li's face was now bright red, a combination of humiliation and rage. He had gone from predator to prey in the span of 30 seconds, and every instinct told him to lash out, to reassert his dominance through sheer force of wealth and position. "How dare you speak to me that way?" Li exploded, switching back to English so everyone could understand his outrage. "Do you know who I am? Do you have any idea what I could do to you?" David's response was delivered with the patience of a teacher addressing a particularly difficult student. "I certainly know who you are, Mr. Li. You are a man with much money but little wisdom. Money can buy many things, but it cannot buy character, it cannot buy genuine respect, and it cannot buy peace of mind." The philosophical depth of David's response sent murmurs throughout the ballroom. This was not the response of an uneducated service worker. This was the kind of wisdom that came from years of study, reflection, and genuine understanding of human nature. Li Zhang was now completely off balance. Every weapon in his arsenal, wealth, social position, assumed intellectual superiority, had been neutralized by David's unexpected eloquence. Worse, the longer the exchange continued, the more Li's own behavior was exposed as petty, cruel, and beneath the dignity expected of someone in his position. "Who do you think you are?" Li snarled in Mandarin, making one last attempt to assert dominance in his native language. David's smile was gentle, almost sympathetic as he delivered his response. "I am someone who knows that true power comes from within, not from a bank account. I am someone who understands that service is an honor, not a shame. I am someone who would never use my advantages to humiliate those who cannot defend themselves." The final sentence landed like a hammer blow. Li Zhang, the man who had spent the evening demonstrating his superiority, had just been lectured on dignity by the very person he had tried to humiliate. And the lecture had been delivered with such grace, such intelligence, such perfect command of language and philosophy, that even Li's most loyal supporters were beginning to look at him with new eyes. The ballroom erupted in whispered conversations. Guests who had been silent observers were now actively discussing what they had just witnessed. Several people had pulled out their phones, though whether to record the confrontation or simply to share the news with friends, David couldn't tell. Li Zhang sat in stunned silence, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, he had encountered someone who could match his intelligence while surpassing his character. The waiter he had dismissed as ignorant had just given him a masterclass in wisdom, dignity, and the proper use of power. And David wasn't done yet. I'm getting chills just thinking about David's perfect response. If you're as amazed by his eloquence as I am, smash that subscribe button and let's see what happens when Li Zhang tries to fight back. What do you think Li Zhang will do next? Will he apologize and show genuine remorse? Or will he try to retaliate and make things worse for himself? Let me know your prediction in the comments. Li Zhang's world was crumbling around him, but like many powerful men who had never faced real consequences for their actions, his response to being challenged was not introspection, it was escalation. The humiliation of being outsmarted by someone he considered beneath him was intolerable, and his wounded pride demanded retaliation. "You arrogant," Li began in Mandarin, his voice rising as he prepared to launch into another tirade, but David cut him off with a gesture that was somehow both respectful and authoritative. "Let me save you some time and dignity," David said calmly in Mandarin. The interruption was so unexpected, delivered with such quiet confidence, that Li actually stopped mid-sentence. Around the ballroom, guests were now openly staring, many having abandoned all pretense of polite dinner conversation to watch this extraordinary confrontation unfold. David turned slightly to address not just Li, but the entire room, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent space. "My name is David Carter. I'm currently completing my PhD in linguistic anthropology at Columbia University, with a focus on cross-cultural communication and the sociology of language. I speak Mandarin, Cantonese, Japanese, and Korean fluently, and I'm conversational in 6 other languages." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Margaret Rothschild gasped audibly. Vladimir Petrov leaned back in his chair as if he'd been slapped. Even the staff members who had gathered at the edges of the room looked surprised. They knew David was smart, but this level of education was far beyond what anyone had suspected. Li Zhang's face went through another series of emotional gymnastics. The man he had dismissed as an ignorant servant was not only multilingual but was pursuing one of the most demanding academic degrees available. The cognitive dissonance was almost too much to process. But David wasn't finished with his revelations. "I'm working here tonight," David continued, "not because I lack options, but because my mother is battling stage 3 breast cancer. The treatments that insurance doesn't cover cost approximately $8,000 per month. I work here 3 nights a week, at a restaurant downtown 4 nights a week, and teach Mandarin to business executives on weekends. Every dollar I earn goes directly to keeping my mother alive." The ballroom was now completely silent except for the soft sound of someone crying. The emotional weight of David's words had transformed what began as a simple case of workplace harassment into something much more profound. A glimpse into the hidden struggles that define so many lives, the sacrifices that remain invisible to those who have never had to make them. Li Zhang looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Every assumption he had made about David had been systematically demolished. The lazy, ignorant servant existed only in Li's prejudiced imagination. The reality was a brilliant young man sacrificing his own comfort to save his mother's life, demonstrating a kind of love and dedication that Li's wealth could never purchase. "Furthermore," David continued, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who had reclaimed control of the narrative, "I want to address what you said earlier about cultural differences in work ethic and respect." David stepped closer to Li's table, not in a threatening manner, but with the confidence of someone about to deliver a lecture to a student who had clearly not done the reading. "In traditional Chinese culture," David said, switching seamlessly between English and Mandarin to ensure his meaning was perfectly clear, "there is a concept called mianzi, face or dignity. But true mianzi isn't gained by humiliating others. It's earned through demonstrating virtue, wisdom, and compassion, especially toward those who cannot defend themselves." Li winced as if he'd been physically struck. David was using Li's own cultural heritage to illustrate exactly how far Li had strayed from the values he claimed to represent. "There's also the concept of guanxi, relationships built on mutual respect and obligation," David continued. "But what you demonstrated tonight wasn't guanxi. It was the behavior of someone who mistakes fear for respect, who confuses wealth with worth." The philosophical precision of David's critique was devastating. He wasn't just defending himself, he was systematically deconstructing Li's entire worldview using the very cultural framework Li had claimed as his own. Several guests were now nodding in agreement, their sympathy having shifted completely from Li to David. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had completely reversed. The man in the expensive suit was revealed as small and petty, while the man in the service uniform stood as a figure of dignity and wisdom. "You make me feel ashamed," Li mumbled in Mandarin, his voice barely audible. It was the first honest thing Li had said all evening, and David's response demonstrated the kind of grace that true education and character can produce. "Shame can be the beginning of growth," David replied gently in Mandarin, "if we allow it to teach us rather than consume us." The kindness in David's response, offering wisdom and potential redemption even to someone who had tried to humiliate him, brought tears to several guests' eyes. This was not just intelligence or linguistic skill, this was emotional maturity and spiritual depth that commanded respect regardless of social position or economic status. Li Zhang sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of his behavior settling on him like a heavy coat. Around the ballroom, guests were beginning to approach David, introducing themselves, asking about his studies, offering business cards and networking opportunities. Dr. Patricia Williams, a university president who had been sitting 2 tables away, was the first to reach David's side. "Young man," she said, "I would very much like to discuss your research. We have a linguistics department that could use someone with your particular combination of academic excellence and real-world experience." Others quickly followed. A tech entrepreneur offered David a consulting position helping his company expand into Asian markets. A pharmaceutical executive, upon learning about David's mother's condition, quietly slipped David a business card with a note about experimental treatments and financial assistance programs. The evening that had begun with Li Zhang holding court as the most important person in the room was ending with David surrounded by people eager to help, to learn from him, to offer him opportunities that could change his life. Li Zhang watched this transformation with a mixture of emotions, regret, embarrassment, and perhaps the beginning of genuine self-reflection. The man he had tried to destroy was being celebrated, while he sat alone at his expensive table, wealthy but suddenly very, very small. This transformation is absolutely incredible. If you're as moved by David's grace under pressure as I am, you have to subscribe right now. This story is changing everything we think we know about dignity and respect. Do you believe that class and wealth should determine how we treat others, or should respect be based on character and how someone conducts themselves? Share your thoughts. This question goes to the heart of what kind of society we want to live in. The Grand Meridian's crystal ballroom had been completely transformed. What began as Li Zhang's carefully orchestrated display of wealth and power had become David Carter's moment of triumph, not through aggression or retaliation, but through the quiet demonstration of dignity, intelligence, and grace under pressure. Li Zhang sat alone at his table, his expensive dinner growing cold, watching as the very people who had laughed at his cruel jokes now surrounded the man he had tried to humiliate. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Li, isolated despite his billions, and David, suddenly the most sought-after person in the room despite wearing a waiter's uniform. Dr. Patricia Williams was deep in conversation with David about his dissertation research. "The intersection of language and power dynamics is fascinating," she was saying. "Your first-hand experience with how linguistic assumptions shape social interactions could contribute significantly to our understanding of cross-cultural communication." Meanwhile, tech entrepreneur Michael Chen had pulled out his phone to show David his company's expansion plans in China. "We need someone who understands not just the language but the cultural nuances. Your academic background combined with your practical experience makes you exactly what we've been looking for." The pharmaceutical executive, Dr. Sarah Goldstein, had taken a different approach entirely. She pressed a business card into David's hand along with a handwritten note. "This is the direct number for our patient advocacy program," she explained quietly. "They specialize in cases exactly like your mother's. Call tomorrow and mention my name. We'll make sure she gets the treatments she needs." Each new connection, each offer of help or opportunity, drove home just how completely Li Zhang had misjudged the situation. The man he had dismissed as unworthy of basic respect was revealing himself to be exactly the kind of person these successful individuals wanted in their networks: intelligent, multilingual, culturally aware, and possessed of the kind of character that money couldn't buy. But perhaps the most telling moment came when Li Zhang finally found the courage to approach David directly. The ballroom had begun to empty as guests reluctantly concluded their conversations and headed toward the exits, many exchanging contact information with David and making plans for follow-up meetings. Li walked slowly toward David, his earlier arrogance replaced by something much more complex. Embarrassment, certainly, but also what might have been the beginning of genuine remorse. The other guests noticed his approach and tactfully stepped aside, sensing that this conversation needed to happen privately. "David," Li began, his voice much quieter than it had been all evening. He paused, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come easily to someone accustomed to commanding rather than apologizing. "Mr. Li," David responded, his tone neutral but not unkind. "I owe you an apology," Li said, the words clearly difficult for him to speak. My behavior tonight was inexcusable. I made assumptions about you based on prejudices that I thought I had outgrown. I was wrong and I'm sorry. David studied Lee's face for a moment, perhaps weighing the sincerity of the apology against the cruelty of the insults that had preceded it. When he spoke, his words carried the same wisdom that had characterized all his responses throughout the evening. An apology is the first step, David said in Mandarin, then continued in English. An apology is the first step, but real change requires examining why we made those assumptions in the first place. Lee nodded slowly, the weight of David's words settling on him. You're right. I've spent so many years surrounded by people who tell me what I want to hear that I forgot how to see people as they actually are rather than how I expect them to be. We all make assumptions, David replied with characteristic grace. The difference is what we do when those assumptions are challenged. Tonight, you have a choice. You can dismiss this as an anomaly and return to your old patterns, or you can use this as an opportunity to grow. Lee was quiet for a long moment, processing not just David's words but the entire evening's events. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a humility that had been completely absent earlier. What would you suggest? David smiled, and for the first time all evening, it reached his eyes when he looked at Lee. Start by truly listening to people instead of just waiting for your turn to speak. Learn about their stories before you judge their worth. And remember that dignity isn't something you can give or take away from others. It's something they possess inherently. As Li Zhang left the ballroom that night, he carried with him something more valuable than any business deal he had ever closed, a lesson in humility delivered by someone he had underestimated completely. The man who arrived at the dinner believing his wealth made him superior to everyone around him departed with the understanding that true worth had nothing to do with bank balances. But David's story was far from over. In the days and weeks that followed, the connections made that evening began to bear fruit in ways that would transform not just his life, but the lives of countless others. Dr. Patricia Williams offered David a full fellowship to complete his PhD, with additional funding for his research and a guaranteed position as a professor upon graduation. The tech entrepreneur Michael Chen hired him as a cultural consultant, providing a salary that would cover his mother's medical expenses while allowing him to continue his studies. Most importantly, Dr. Sarah Goldstein's patient advocacy program not only covered David's mother's treatments but connected her with an experimental therapy that would ultimately save her life. The woman who had sacrificed everything to give her son opportunities was finally receiving the care she deserved. But perhaps the most unexpected development came 6 months later, when Li Zhang contacted David with an unusual request. Li had spent the intervening months in genuine self-reflection, examining not just his behavior that night but the patterns of thought that had led to it. He wanted to establish a foundation focused on educational opportunities for working students, people like David who possessed tremendous potential but lacked the financial resources to fully pursue their dreams. I want you to help me design this foundation, Lee told David during their first meeting since that night at the Grand Meridian. I want to make sure we're not just throwing money at problems, but actually creating pathways for people to achieve their goals with dignity. The foundation they created together became a model for educational philanthropy, providing not just financial support but mentorship, networking opportunities, and the kind of respect that David had fought for that night in the ballroom. Li Zhang learned to use his wealth as a tool for empowerment rather than control, while David gained the resources to expand his impact far beyond what he could have achieved alone. Within 3 years, the foundation had supported over 200 students from diverse backgrounds, providing them with opportunities to pursue advanced degrees while maintaining their self-respect and dignity. Many of the recipients went on to become leaders in their fields, carrying forward the lesson that David had taught that night, that true worth comes from character, not circumstances. The story of that evening at the Grand Meridian became legendary in certain circles, told and retold as an example of how grace and intelligence can triumph over prejudice and cruelty. But for those who lived it, the real significance wasn't in the dramatic confrontation itself, it was in what came after. David completed his PhD and became a professor, specializing in the very dynamics of power and language that he had navigated so skillfully that night. His research contributed to a better understanding of how assumptions based on appearance, occupation, and social class affect human interactions, and his work influenced policies in education, business, and social services. Li Zhang transformed from a man who used his wealth to elevate himself above others into someone who used his resources to lift others up. The foundation became his greatest legacy, more meaningful to him than any of his business achievements because it represented genuine human connection and positive change. But perhaps most importantly, David's mother recovered fully from her cancer, living to see her son graduate with his doctorate, publish groundbreaking research, and change countless lives through his teaching and advocacy. The woman who had raised him to believe in the power of education and the importance of treating everyone with respect watched as those values transformed not just their family's circumstances, but the lives of hundreds of other families as well. The evening that began with cruel assumptions about a black waiter ended with a profound demonstration of how wrong those assumptions could be. It showed that intelligence, dignity, and worth have nothing to do with the uniform someone wears or the job they perform to support their family. Most importantly, it proved that even the most entrenched prejudices can be challenged and overcome when someone has the courage to speak truth to power with grace and wisdom. In the end, the story wasn't really about a millionaire learning to respect a waiter. It was about two human beings discovering their capacity for growth, connection, and positive change. It was about the power of education to transform not just individual lives but entire communities. And it was about the truth that in a world often divided by wealth, race, and social status, our shared humanity remains the most important thing we have in common. The Grand Meridian's Crystal Ballroom returned to hosting elegant dinners for wealthy guests, but the story of that extraordinary evening continued to ripple outward, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways both large and small. And somewhere in New York City, a professor continued to teach his students that true power comes not from putting others down, but from lifting them up, a lesson learned on a night when assumptions met reality and dignity triumphed over prejudice. This story proves that respect should never be determined by someone's job, their background, or their current circumstances. If this incredible journey of dignity and transformation moved you like it moved me, please subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like David's remind us that we should never judge a book by its cover, and that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the most unexpected sources. After hearing this complete story, I want to ask you, do you believe that dignity is the greatest power someone can carry, regardless of their position in life? And more importantly, how will you treat the next service worker, student, or person in a lower status job that you encounter? Will you see them as David, someone with dreams, intelligence, and a story worth respecting? Share your thoughts below, and let's start a conversation about treating everyone with the dignity they deserve.